You're a young mother in 1347, standing in the drafty stone chamber of your medieval home, holding your crying infant as dawn breaks through the single window. Your baby has soiled himself again, and you look down at the mess with a mixture of exhaustion and resignation. But there are no diapers to change, no wipes to clean with, no modern conveniences to make this moment easier. Instead, you face a reality that would horrify today's parents. Your child will spend most of his early years essentially naked from the waist down, and you'll spend yours constantly cleaning up the consequences. As you wrap your baby in strips of old linen for the third time today, you can't help but wonder how your mother managed, how her mother before her survived, and how countless generations of women navigated the messy, dangerous, and often heartbreaking world of medieval motherhood. What you don't realize is that you're part of a system so different from modern parenting that it would seem almost alien to contemporary mothers. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and ingenuity, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The question of how medieval children survived without diapers opens a window into a world where motherhood was simultaneously more natural and more brutal than anything we can imagine today. These weren't just different parenting techniques or cultural preferences we're talking about. This was an entirely different understanding of childhood, cleanliness, and survival itself. To understand medieval motherhood, you must first abandon every modern assumption about babies and hygiene. In the 14th century, the very concept of keeping a baby continuously clean and dry would have seemed not just impossible, but potentially harmful. Medieval mothers believed that a child's natural bodily functions were healthy expressions that shouldn't be restricted or contained. Instead of diapers, medieval mothers relied on what they called swaddling cloths. But these weren't the neat, absorbent wraps you might imagine. These were long strips of linen or wool that wound around the baby's entire body like a mummy, designed more to keep the child still and supposedly safe than to manage waste. The swaddling was so tight that babies couldn't move their arms or legs, based on the medieval belief that unrestricted movement would cause deformities or weakness. When a baby soiled these cloths, which happened constantly, the mother would unwrap the entire bundle, clean what she could with whatever water was available, and rewrap the child in fresh strips if she had them. If she didn't have clean cloths, which was often the case for poorer families, she might simply scrape off the worst of the mess and reuse the same strips. But here's where it gets truly shocking. Many medieval babies spent significant portions of their day completely naked from the waist down. This wasn't neglect or poverty, though those certainly played roles. This was a deliberate choice based on medieval understanding of child health and development. Medieval mothers believed that exposure to air and natural elements strengthened children's constitutions. They thought that keeping babies too clean or too covered would make them weak and susceptible to illness. So a baby might spend hours each day lying on straw or rough blankets, free to soil himself and his surroundings without any barrier or protection. The implications of this approach were staggering. Medieval homes reeked constantly of human waste. Floors were covered in rushes or straw that absorbed urine and feces, creating a fermenting carpet of filth that was replaced only occasionally. The smell was so pervasive that visitors from other regions often commented on the distinctive odor of households with young children. But mothers had developed ingenious, if disturbing, methods for managing this reality. They learned to read their babies' natural rhythms, holding them over chamber pots or even out windows when they sensed elimination was imminent. This practice, called elimination communication by modern historians, required constant attention and intimate knowledge of each child's bodily patterns. Some mothers created what they called baby nests, shallow depressions in the floor filled with absorbent materials like moss, sheep's wool, or shredded cloth. The baby would be placed in this nest during the day, and the soiled materials would be removed and replaced as needed. These nests were often shared by multiple children, creating communal waste management systems that would horrify modern parents. The cleaning process itself was a daily ordeal that consumed hours of a mother's time. Water was precious and often contaminated, so babies were rarely fully bathed. Instead, mothers used techniques passed down through generations, wiping with moss or soft leaves, scraping with wooden tools, and using animal fats to create protective barriers on the baby's skin. Medieval mothers also relied heavily on what they called protective pastes, mixtures of animal fat, herbs, and sometimes honey that they spread on their babies' bottoms and genitals. These pastes served multiple purposes. They created a barrier against moisture, supposedly prevented rashes, and were believed to have medicinal properties that would protect the child from illness and evil spirits. The social implications of this approach to infant care were profound. Motherhood in medieval times wasn't the private, domestic experience we know today. It was a communal activity where multiple women shared the burden of managing constantly soiled children. Extended families, neighbors, and even older children participated in the endless cycle of cleaning and changing. Villages developed elaborate systems for sharing resources related to childcare. Women would pool their supplies of clean cloths, take turns preparing protective pastes, and collectively manage the disposal of waste. This created networks of mutual support, but also intense social pressure and judgment about how well a mother managed her children's hygiene. The mortality implications were devastating. Without proper sanitation, medieval babies died at rates that would be unthinkable today. Diarrheal diseases, skin infections, and complications from constant exposure to waste claimed countless lives. Mothers learned to expect that not all their children would survive, and their parenting practices reflected this grim reality. But perhaps most shocking was how medieval society normalized this level of filth and discomfort for its most vulnerable members. Church teaching suggested that suffering purified the soul even in infancy. Medical texts argued that exposure to waste strengthened children's natural defenses. Social customs made elaborate cleanliness a sign of vanity or excessive concern with worldly matters. This wasn't just about practical limitations or lack of technology. Medieval society had made philosophical and cultural choices about childhood that prioritized different values than we hold today. They valued toughness over comfort, spiritual preparation over physical cleanliness, and community resilience over individual well-being. The daily routine of a medieval mother reveals just how consuming this approach to childcare really was. She would wake before dawn to check on babies who had been lying in their own waste all night. She would spend the morning hours unwrapping, cleaning, and rewrapping multiple children, often while managing household duties like cooking and cleaning. The afternoon might bring communal washing sessions where neighborhood women gathered at wells or streams to clean soiled cloths and share information about child-rearing techniques. These sessions weren't just practical necessities. They were crucial social events where mothers received support, advice, and validation for their exhausting work. Evenings often meant preparing protective pastes and ointments for the next day, mending and preparing cloths, and settling children for a night that would inevitably bring more soiling and more work. The cycle was relentless, and mothers often worked themselves to physical and emotional exhaustion trying to keep up with the demands. The economic burden was equally crushing. Even the poorest families had to dedicate significant resources to managing infant waste. Cloths wore out quickly and needed constant replacement. Protective pastes required expensive ingredients like animal fats and imported herbs. The time mothers spent on hygiene management was time they couldn't spend on other income-generating activities. Wealthier families developed elaborate systems that showcased their status while managing the same basic challenges. They might employ wet nurses who specialized in infant care, maintain larger supplies of clean cloths, and use more expensive protective treatments. But even wealth couldn't eliminate the fundamental reality of caring for babies without modern sanitation. The psychological impact on medieval mothers was profound and largely undocumented. These women lived with constant anxiety about their children's health and survival. They endured social judgment about their housekeeping and child-rearing skills. They faced daily physical discomfort from handling waste and working in unsanitary conditions. Yet within this challenging system, medieval mothers developed remarkable skills and knowledge that modern parents have largely lost. They could diagnose illness from the color and consistency of infant waste with accuracy that impressed even medieval physicians. They understood herbal treatments and natural remedies that actually provided some protection against infection and disease. They also developed emotional resilience and community bonds that helped them survive the enormous pressures of medieval motherhood. The shared experience of managing children without modern conveniences created deep friendships and support networks that sustained women through the darkest periods of infant mortality and family crisis. As we continue exploring this hidden world of medieval motherhood, we'll discover even more shocking realities about how children survived their earliest years. We'll examine the ingenious but often dangerous methods mothers used to protect their babies from disease, the social hierarchies that determined which children received better care, and the religious beliefs that shaped every aspect of infant management. The story of medieval motherhood isn't just about the absence of diapers. It's about an entire civilization that made fundamentally different choices about childhood, cleanliness, and survival. Understanding these choices helps us appreciate not just how far we've come, but also what we might have lost in our modern approach to raising children. The religious dimension of medieval childcare reveals perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this entire system. Medieval mothers weren't just dealing with practical challenges, they were navigating a complex web of spiritual beliefs that directly influenced how they treated their babies' most basic needs. The Catholic Church taught that suffering purified the soul, and this applied even to infants who couldn't yet comprehend sin or salvation. Priests regularly visited homes to inspect how mothers were caring for their children, not from a health perspective, but to ensure that babies weren't being made too comfortable. A mother who seemed overly concerned with keeping her child clean might be accused of vanity or worldly attachment. Church doctrine suggested that babies who experienced discomfort and exposure were being prepared for the hardships of Christian life. This created an impossible situation for medieval mothers. Their natural instincts to protect and comfort their children were constantly at war with religious teachings that demanded they allow suffering as spiritual preparation. Mothers who tried too hard to keep their babies clean and comfortable risked being labeled as spiritually weak or dangerously attached to earthly concerns. The church also promoted specific rituals around infant waste that seem almost incomprehensible today. Some regions practiced ceremonies where the first soiled cloth from a newborn was blessed and then buried in consecrated ground, supposedly to protect the child's soul. Other areas required mothers to save samples of their baby's waste for examination by religious authorities, who claimed they could read spiritual signs in the consistency and color. Medieval medical understanding compounded these religious pressures with theories that seem completely backward by modern standards. Physicians taught that babies needed to be exposed to their own waste to develop proper humoral balance. They believed that the four bodily humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, required constant rebalancing through exposure to natural elements, including human waste. Doctors prescribed specific treatments that involved applying fresh urine to infant skin conditions, using fecal matter as poultices for wounds, and encouraging mothers to taste their baby's waste to diagnose illness. These weren't desperate measures by ignorant people. These were the recommended practices of the most educated medical minds of the medieval period. The seasonal challenges of this system created additional layers of complexity that pushed medieval mothers to their breaking points. Winter months were particularly brutal, as frozen ground made waste disposal nearly impossible, and indoor heating was minimal. Mothers would layer their babies in every available cloth, creating massive bundles that trapped moisture and waste against tender skin for days at a time. Spring brought the horror of discovering what had accumulated under the snow throughout the winter months. Entire villages would be surrounded by months' worth of frozen human waste that would thaw into a putrid soup of disease and contamination. Mothers spent weeks just trying to clear enough clean space around their homes to safely manage their children's daily needs. Summer presented different but equally challenging problems. Heat intensified odors and accelerated the decomposition of waste, creating breeding grounds for insects and disease. Mothers learned to work primarily at dawn and dusk, when temperatures were cooler and the smell was slightly more bearable. Many families moved their children outdoors during the hottest months, creating temporary shelters where waste could be more easily managed. Autumn meant preparing for another winter of accumulated filth, gathering and preserving whatever materials would be needed to survive months of limited mobility and waste disposal options. Mothers would spend harvest season not just preserving food, but stockpiling absorbent materials, protective pastes, and cleaning supplies that would need to last until spring. The tools medieval mothers used for managing infant waste reveal the ingenuity born from desperate necessity. They crafted scrapers from animal bones, carved shallow bowls from wood for collecting waste, and developed complex systems of ropes and pulleys for hanging soiled cloths in whatever space was available. These tools were often passed down through generations, becoming family heirlooms that represented survival knowledge accumulated over decades. Some mothers created elaborate contraptions that seem almost medieval versions of modern baby equipment. They built wooden frames that could hold babies at angles designed to direct waste away from sleeping areas. They developed systems of layered materials that could be removed in sections, minimizing the disruption to the child when cleaning was necessary. The most resourceful mothers learned to use natural materials in ways that provided some protection and absorption. Moss gathered from specific locations was prized for its absorbent qualities and supposed medicinal properties. Certain types of leaves were collected and dried for use as primitive wipes. Animal wool was processed and treated to create somewhat effective barriers against moisture. But perhaps the most shocking aspect of medieval childcare was how it shaped the relationship between mothers and their babies. Modern parents bond with their children through activities like feeding, playing, and cuddling. Medieval mothers bonded with their children primarily through the intimate, constant process of managing their waste and protecting them from the health consequences of their unsanitary environment. This created relationships of intense physical intimacy, but also profound practical necessity. Medieval mothers knew their children's bodies in ways that modern parents never experience. They could diagnose illness from subtle changes in waste consistency, predict feeding needs from the timing of elimination, and assess overall health from the color and smell of bodily functions. Yet this same intimacy was shadowed by the constant awareness that these children might not survive. Medieval mothers learned to love fiercely while simultaneously protecting themselves emotionally from the high probability of loss. This created a complex emotional landscape where deep affection coexisted with practical detachment, a psychological balancing act that modern parents rarely need to master. The social hierarchies within medieval communities were clearly visible in how different families managed infant care. Wealthy families might have servants dedicated specifically to waste management, allowing mothers to maintain some distance from the most unpleasant aspects of child rearing. These servants, usually young women from poorer families, bore the brunt of the physical and emotional toll while receiving minimal compensation or recognition. Middle-class families developed cooperative arrangements where multiple households shared resources and labor. These communities created informal networks of expertise, where women who had successfully raised multiple children to adulthood became valuable advisors to younger mothers struggling with the challenges of medieval childcare. The poorest families often had no choice but to rely on older children to help manage their younger siblings' needs. Children as young as 5 or 6 were expected to participate in cleaning, disposal, and care activities that would be considered inappropriate for modern children. This early exposure to adult responsibilities created a different understanding of childhood itself, where children were viewed as small adults rather than innocent beings requiring protection. The psychological impact on these older children was significant, but rarely acknowledged. They grew up understanding that life was harsh, that comfort was rare, and that survival required constant vigilance and hard work. Many developed premature maturity and resilience, but also missed the play and exploration that modern child development experts consider essential. Regional variations in medieval childcare practices reveal how different communities adapted these basic challenges to their specific environments and resources. Coastal communities used seaweed and salt water for cleaning, believing these materials had purifying properties. Mountain communities relied on specific herbs and minerals found in their local environment. Desert regions developed techniques for conserving water while still maintaining minimal hygiene standards. These regional differences weren't just practical adaptations, they were cultural statements about what each community valued and how they understood the relationship between humans and their environment. Some communities emphasized toughness and exposure, believing that harsh conditions created stronger adults. Others focused more on community cooperation and shared responsibility for child welfare. The tools and techniques that proved most effective were jealously guarded secrets passed down through maternal lineages. Mothers taught their daughters not just how to manage infant waste, but how to read the signs that predicted illness, how to prepare protective treatments, and how to navigate the social expectations surrounding childcare. This knowledge was considered as valuable as any other family inheritance. As we delve deeper into this medieval world, the contrast with modern parenting becomes even more stark. But understanding these historical realities isn't just an academic exercise. It reveals fundamental questions about how societies choose to care for their most vulnerable members and what those choices reveal about their values, beliefs, and understanding of human nature itself. The trading networks that developed around medieval childcare revealed just how desperate mothers were for any solution that might ease their burden. Merchants who traveled between villages quickly learned that certain items commanded premium prices from exhausted mothers. Soft mosses from distant forests, animal fats with supposed healing properties, and herbs rumored to prevent the skin infections that claimed so many infant lives. These traders carried more than just goods, they carried knowledge. A technique that worked in one village might be adapted and spread across entire regions through these informal networks. Mothers would trade precious household items for information about new methods of waste management or protective treatments that had proven successful elsewhere. The desperation driving this trade was palpable. Mothers would give up food for their own families to purchase materials they hoped might keep their babies healthier. They would walk for miles to meet traveling merchants, carrying samples of their children's waste to ask for diagnostic advice from strangers who claimed medical knowledge. But this desperation also made medieval mothers vulnerable to exploitation. Unscrupulous traders sold worthless potions and treatments to women who had no way to verify their effectiveness. Snake oil salesmen of the medieval period targeted mothers specifically, knowing they would try anything that promised to reduce their children's suffering or improve their chances of survival. The seasonal markets that developed around childcare needs became crucial community events. Mothers would gather not just to purchase supplies, but to share techniques, compare results, and find emotional support from other women facing the same overwhelming challenges. These markets were among the few places where women could speak openly about their struggles without fear of religious or social judgment. The most successful merchants learned to position themselves as more than just sellers. They became advisors, confidants, and sources of hope for desperate mothers. They would remember individual families, ask about specific children's progress, and offer personalized recommendations based on what had worked for similar cases in other villages. The economic impact of medieval childcare extended far beyond individual families. Entire industries developed around the needs of mothers managing children without modern sanitation. Cloth production focused heavily on materials suitable for infant wrapping. Herbal cultivation prioritized plants believed to have protective or healing properties for children's skin. Specialized craftspeople emerged who created tools specifically for childcare. Wooden scrapers designed to remove waste without injuring tender skin, bowls shaped to catch elimination efficiently, and frames constructed to hold babies at optimal angles for waste management. These artisans often worked exclusively for wealthier families, creating custom solutions that poor mothers could only dream of affording. The time investment required for medieval childcare was staggering when calculated across entire communities. Historians estimate that mothers spent between 4 and 6 hours daily just on waste-related care for each infant. In villages with multiple young children, this represented a massive portion of the community's total labor capacity dedicated to basic hygiene management. This time burden had profound implications for women's roles in medieval society. Mothers with young children were effectively removed from most economic activities, unable to contribute to agricultural work, craft production, or trade. This created additional financial pressure on families already struggling with the cost of childcare supplies and medical treatments. The physical toll on medieval mothers was equally devastating. Constant exposure to waste and contamination led to high rates of infection and illness among caregivers. Many mothers developed chronic conditions related to their childcare duties. Respiratory problems from constant exposure to foul air, skin conditions from handling waste, and digestive issues from contaminated water used for cleaning. The emotional exhaustion was perhaps even more destructive. Medieval mothers lived in constant fear that their children would die from preventable diseases caused by poor sanitation. They carried enormous guilt when children did become ill, wondering if they had failed to clean thoroughly enough or used the wrong protective treatments. Sleep deprivation was universal among mothers of young children. Babies who soiled themselves throughout the night required constant attention, and the cleaning process was too complex to be done quickly or quietly. Mothers often went weeks without more than a few hours of consecutive sleep, leading to physical and mental health problems that compounded their other challenges. The social isolation experienced by medieval mothers was profound. The constant smell and visible signs of their childcare struggles made them unwelcome in many social situations. Churches often relegated mothers with young children to separate sections, both to contain the odors and to prevent the distraction of crying, soiled babies during services. This isolation was particularly cruel because it came at a time when mothers most needed community support and encouragement. Instead of receiving help and understanding, they often faced judgment and criticism from community members who had forgotten the realities of caring for infants or who had never experienced these challenges themselves. The impact on marriage relationships was significant and rarely discussed in historical records. The constant demands of childcare, combined with the physical and emotional exhaustion of medieval mothers, strained partnerships that were already under pressure from economic hardship and high child mortality rates. Fathers often felt helpless and frustrated by their inability to assist with the most time-consuming aspects of childcare. Medieval gender roles strictly prohibited men from participating in waste management or intimate care activities, leaving mothers to bear the entire burden alone while their partners watched their struggles without being able to help. The generational knowledge transfer that occurred around medieval childcare created complex family dynamics. Older women who had successfully raised children to adulthood held enormous power and authority within their communities. Their advice was sought desperately by younger mothers, but this wisdom often came with harsh judgment about modern techniques or perceived weaknesses in child-rearing practices. These intergenerational relationships could be sources of crucial support, but they could also create additional pressure and conflict. Older women might criticize younger mothers for being too soft or too concerned with cleanliness, while younger mothers struggled to balance traditional techniques with their own instincts about what might be best for their children. The documentation of medieval childcare practices was limited and heavily filtered through male perspectives that rarely understood the daily realities mothers faced. Most historical records were written by monks or educated men who had minimal direct experience with infant care. Their accounts often focused on religious or moral aspects while completely ignoring the practical challenges that consumed mothers' lives. This historical gap means that much of what we know about medieval motherhood has been reconstructed from indirect evidence. Archaeological remains, economic records, and scattered references in personal letters or legal documents. The voices of the mothers themselves, their fears, hopes, innovations, and survival strategies have been largely lost to history. The medical theories that guided medieval childcare were often contradictory and confusing for mothers trying to make practical decisions. Different authorities recommended opposing approaches. Some insisted that babies needed maximum exposure to natural elements, while others argued for protective covering in controlled environments. These conflicting expert opinions left mothers in impossible positions, forced to choose between treatments that might help or harm their children, with no reliable way to determine which approach was correct. Many mothers developed their own hybrid techniques, combining elements from different medical traditions based on what seemed to work for their specific children. The seasonal rhythms of medieval life created predictable cycles of crisis and relief in childcare management. Mothers learned to anticipate the challenges each season would bring and to prepare accordingly. But they could never fully escape the relentless demands of caring for children without adequate tools or sanitation. Spring cleaning took on literal life-or-death importance as mothers worked to clear away the accumulated waste and contamination of winter months. Summer brought some relief through improved disposal options, but also intensified the health risks associated with heat and decomposition. Autumn was a race to prepare for another winter of limited options and increased vulnerability. These seasonal patterns created community-wide events where mothers worked together to address shared challenges. Spring cleaning became a collective effort where entire villages participated in waste removal and sanitation projects. Autumn preparation involved community-wide gathering and processing of materials that would be needed during the harsh winter months. The innovations that emerged from medieval motherhood were remarkable examples of human ingenuity under extreme constraints. Mothers developed techniques for waste management that maximized limited resources, created protective treatments from available natural materials, and organized community support systems that helped families survive the most challenging periods. Some of these innovations were remarkably effective given the limitations of medieval technology and knowledge. Certain herbal treatments actually did provide protection against infection. Community waste management systems, while primitive, did reduce some health risks compared to completely unmanaged disposal. Cooperative childcare arrangements allowed mothers to share the overwhelming burden of constant vigilance. But the cost of these innovations was enormous, paid primarily by women who sacrificed their health, comfort, and opportunities to develop solutions that barely allowed their children to survive. The medieval approach to childcare represented a system where individual heroism compensated for societal failures to protect the most vulnerable members of the community. The psychological resilience developed by medieval mothers was extraordinary, forged through daily confrontation with challenges that would overwhelm most modern parents. These women learned to function under conditions of constant stress, uncertainty, and physical discomfort while maintaining the emotional strength necessary to nurture their children. Yet this resilience came at a tremendous cost. Many medieval mothers developed what we might now recognize as symptoms of chronic stress and trauma: emotional numbness, hypervigilance, and difficulty forming secure attachments even with their own children. The survival strategies that allowed them to function in medieval conditions also created lasting psychological damage that affected entire families and communities. As we prepare to explore the final shocking realities of medieval motherhood, including the desperate measures mothers took when their children inevitably became ill and the heartbreaking decisions they faced when resources ran out, we begin to understand that this wasn't just a story about different hygiene practices. This was a story about an entire civilization that systematically failed to protect its children and then expected individual mothers to compensate for those failures through superhuman effort and sacrifice. The legacy of medieval motherhood lives on in ways we rarely recognize, embedded in cultural attitudes about child-rearing, women's roles, and the relationship between individual responsibility and community support. Understanding these historical realities helps us appreciate not just the privileges of modern parenting, but also the ongoing challenges faced by mothers in communities where adequate resources and support systems still don't exist. The breaking point for most medieval mothers came not gradually but suddenly, often triggered by the death of a child from preventable disease or the devastating realization that their next baby would face the same impossible odds. These moments of crisis revealed the true horror of a system that demanded superhuman sacrifice from individual women while providing virtually no institutional support. When children inevitably developed the severe skin infections, respiratory diseases, or digestive disorders that thrived in unsanitary conditions, medieval mothers faced choices that would destroy modern parents psychologically. They could watch their child suffer and likely die while continuing to care for other children, or they could dedicate all their time and resources to the sick child, potentially condemning their healthy children to neglect and increased risk. The triage decisions medieval mothers made daily would challenge the most experienced emergency room doctors. Which child's fever was high enough to warrant using precious clean water for cooling? Which infant's skin infection was severe enough to justify trading food for expensive medicinal herbs? Which baby's breathing difficulties required immediate attention versus which could wait until morning? These weren't abstract medical decisions. They were intimate calculations made by exhausted women who knew that every choice might determine which of their children lived or died. Mothers developed a clinical detachment that allowed them to assess their own children's symptoms with brutal objectivity, suppressing maternal instincts that might cloud their judgment about resource allocation. The diagnostic skills medieval mothers developed were remarkable but came at enormous psychological cost. They learned to interpret dozens of subtle signs that indicated impending illness, changes in waist color that predicted digestive problems, skin texture variations that warned of developing infections, breathing patterns that suggested respiratory complications. This knowledge was invaluable for child survival, but transformed mothers into constant medical monitors. Unable to simply enjoy their children's company, sleep became impossible for mothers of sick children, not just because of the immediate care requirements, but because they knew that missing early warning signs could mean death. Many mothers developed chronic insomnia that persisted long after their children recovered, their nervous systems permanently altered by months or years of hypervigilance. The community responses to childhood illness revealed both the best and worst aspects of medieval society. Some neighbors rallied around struggling families, sharing resources and providing emotional support during crisis periods. Others treated illness as evidence of moral failing or divine punishment, ostracizing families when they most needed help. Religious authorities often made these situations worse by suggesting that childhood illness was a test of faith or punishment for parental sins. Mothers were encouraged to pray harder, make larger donations to the church, or accept their children's suffering as God's will. This spiritual framework provided no practical help while adding layers of guilt and self-blame to already overwhelming situations. The economic devastation caused by childhood illness could destroy families for generations. The costs of attempting treatment, purchasing herbs, consulting physicians, traveling to seek specialized care, often exceeded a family's entire annual income. Mothers would sell household goods, trade future labor commitments, or even indenture older children to raise money for treatments that had minimal chances of success. The borrowing networks that developed around childhood medical emergencies created complex webs of debt and obligation that bound communities together but also trapped families in cycles of poverty. A mother who borrowed money to treat one child's illness might spend years working to repay that debt, leaving her unable to invest in prevention or early treatment for her other children. The folk medicine traditions that emerged from this desperation were simultaneously sophisticated and dangerous. Mothers became experts in herbal treatments, developing extensive knowledge about which plants might help specific conditions. But they also experimented with increasingly extreme remedies as conventional treatments failed, sometimes causing more harm than the original illness. Some mothers turned to treatments that bordered on child abuse by modern standards, applying burning substances to infected skin, forcing children to consume toxic plants, or subjecting them to painful procedures that had no medical basis. These weren't acts of cruelty, but desperate attempts by loving mothers who had exhausted all other options and were watching their children die. The psychological impact of losing children to preventable diseases created a particular type of grief that modern parents rarely experience. Medieval mothers couldn't blame random chance or genetic defects. They knew their children died because society had failed to provide basic sanitation and medical care. This knowledge created a rage and bitterness that affected entire communities. Mothers who lost multiple children often became advocates for other struggling families, using their grief as motivation to help prevent similar tragedies. They became repositories of knowledge about what treatments had failed, which symptoms indicated fatal conditions, and how to prepare psychologically for likely loss. This expertise was valuable but came at the cost of their own emotional well-being. The survival strategies developed by mothers who had lost children were heartbreaking in their practicality. They learned to emotionally distance themselves from new babies until those infants passed critical developmental milestones. They avoided naming children for weeks or months, waiting to see if the child would survive long enough to justify the emotional investment of identity. These protective mechanisms allowed medieval mothers to continue functioning and caring for surviving children, but they also created relationships marked by emotional distance and conditional attachment. Children who did survive often grew up understanding that their parents' love was contingent on their continued health and usefulness to the family. The seasonal patterns of childhood illness created predictable waves of community grief and trauma. Winter months brought respiratory diseases that killed dozens of children in small villages. Spring thaws released contaminated water that caused deadly digestive disorders. Summer heat intensified skin infections and fever-related deaths. Autumn brought the terror of preparing for another winter knowing how many children might not survive it. These predictable cycles meant that medieval communities experienced collective trauma on an annual basis. Entire generations grew up expecting that roughly half their childhood companions would die before reaching adulthood. This normalized mortality created cultural attitudes about the value of individual life that would shock modern sensibilities. The mothers who survived multiple child deaths often became informal community leaders, respected for their experience but also feared for their knowledge of suffering. These women could predict which children were likely to survive, which treatments were worth attempting, and how to help families prepare for inevitable losses. Their wisdom was sought, but their presence was also a reminder of everyone's vulnerability. The coping mechanisms these mothers developed included rituals and beliefs that helped them process unbearable loss. Some created elaborate memorial practices that honored dead children while protecting surviving family members from overwhelming grief. Others developed philosophical frameworks that explained child death as part of divine plans or natural cycles beyond human control. The impact of childhood mortality on medieval marriage relationships was profound and rarely discussed in historical records. Couples often blamed each other for children's deaths, arguing about treatment decisions or care practices. The shared trauma could either bind parents together or drive them apart, with no cultural framework for processing grief or maintaining relationships under such extreme stress. Fathers often felt completely helpless during childhood medical crises, excluded from care decisions but forced to watch their children suffer and die. This powerlessness created anger and frustration that many men directed toward their wives, blaming them for failures that were actually systemic problems beyond any individual's control. The religious interpretations of childhood death created additional layers of psychological torment for grieving parents. Church teachings suggested that unbaptized infants couldn't enter heaven, creating panic about emergency baptisms and guilt about children who died before receiving sacraments. Parents were told that excessive grief was a sign of weak faith, forcing them to suppress natural mourning responses. Some mothers developed elaborate secret rituals for honoring dead children that existed outside official religious frameworks. These practices provided emotional outlets but also created additional guilt about potentially sinful behavior. The conflict between natural grief and religious expectations created internal psychological battles that many mothers never resolved. The community memory of childhood deaths was carefully managed to balance acknowledgement with the need to continue functioning. Villages developed traditions for collectively mourning lost children while also celebrating survivors. These rituals helped process community-wide trauma but also reinforced the normalization of child death as an expected part of life. The economic calculations surrounding childhood illness became increasingly brutal as resources became scarcer. Mothers learned to assess not just the likelihood of successful treatment, but also the cost of that treatment relative to the family's ability to care for other children. These calculations were rational but psychologically devastating for women who wanted to save every child. The long-term health consequences for mothers who survived multiple child deaths were severe and largely unrecognized. Chronic stress, malnutrition from prioritizing children's needs, and repeated exposure to infectious diseases created health problems that shortened many mothers' lives. The physical toll of intensive caregiving combined with emotional trauma to create premature aging and early death. The knowledge transfer between generations of mothers was complicated by the trauma associated with childhood illness and death. Older women wanted to prepare younger mothers for likely tragedies, but they also wanted to protect them from the full psychological impact of understanding what they would face. This created incomplete education that left young mothers unprepared for the worst aspects of medieval motherhood. The innovations that emerged from medical crises were remarkable, but often came too late to save the children who inspired them. Mothers who lost children to specific diseases became experts in treating those conditions, developing knowledge that helped other families but couldn't do their own losses. This pattern created communities where expertise was built on accumulated tragedy, The social hierarchies that determined which children received better medical care were stark and cruel. Wealthy families could afford multiple treatment attempts, specialized consultations, and expensive medicines. Poor families often had to choose between feeding healthy children and treating sick ones. Middle-class families bankrupted themselves trying to provide care that wealthy families could afford easily. The geographic isolation of many medieval communities meant that mothers often faced medical crises completely alone, with no access to outside expertise or resources. Rural mothers might walk for days to reach someone with medical knowledge, carrying dying children and leaving other family members unattended. Many children died during these desperate journeys to seek help that often didn't exist. The psychological preparation for child death that medieval mothers underwent was a form of anticipatory grief that modern parents rarely experience. Mothers learned to emotionally prepare for loss while still providing loving care. A psychological balancing act that required enormous mental strength and often resulted in lasting emotional damage. The documentation of childhood deaths in medieval records was sparse and clinical, reflecting societies that had normalized high infant mortality. The individual stories of suffering mothers and dying children were rarely recorded, leaving us with statistical knowledge but little understanding of the human cost of these systemic failures. The legacy of medieval childhood mortality extended far beyond individual families to shape entire cultural attitudes about parenting, risk, and the value of life. Societies that expected high child death rates developed different approaches to emotional investment, resource allocation, and community responsibility that influenced social development for centuries. As we approach the final revelations about medieval motherhood, we must confront the reality that these weren't just historical curiosities or primitive practices that evolution naturally corrected. These were systematic failures by organized societies to protect their most vulnerable members. Failures that required individual mothers to compensate through superhuman sacrifice, often at the cost of their own lives and sanity. The mothers who survived this system were fundamentally changed by their experiences, carrying trauma and knowledge that shaped how they raised surviving children and interacted with their communities. Their stories reveal not just the absence of modern conveniences, but the presence of societal structures that systematically failed to provide basic protection for children and support for the women responsible for their care. Understanding these historical realities forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about our own systems and assumptions. How many of our current parenting challenges stem from lingering cultural attitudes developed during periods when child survival was uncertain? How do modern mothers cope with the psychological pressure of being individually responsible for their children's welfare in societies that still provide inadequate systemic support? The final chapter of medieval motherhood reveals truths that challenge our assumptions about historical progress and force us to examine whether we've truly transcended the fundamental dynamics that made child rearing such a desperate struggle for so many generations of women who deserved far better than the impossible choices they faced daily.